Welcome to the Rehab Links Secrets to Success podcast. I'm Lisa Chase, your host, and today I have one of my favorite people, Nadine Wege, out from Idaho. How are you, Nadine?
I'm doing great, Lisa. Thank you so much for having me on. It's so good to see your face.
Me too. I know. I've been so looking forward to this. So, a little back history on Nadine. So, Nadine is a physical therapist, athletic trainer extraordinaire. And I met her when her and I were working together on the professional women's tennis tour. And we worked together for many years, and we just hit it off and became really good friends. And, we've shared, tips and tricks and our knowledge, whether it be services, treatments, and various products along the way. And I am so excited to kind of hear about what you're doing now. I know that you now have a little bit of a different practice where you now got training in functional medicine. I'm so excited to hear about that. I think that's so great that you're integrating that into your clinical practice as a physical therapist. And Nadine does a lot and has taught me a lot about gait analysis and about foot mechanics and how that really plays a role. And we have very similar philosophies and looking at the whole body. So let's just jump in, and why don't you kind of give our listeners a little background on you and your journey and where you are today.
Sure. Thanks, Lisa. So I'm from the Upper Peninsula, Michigan. That's a thing, right? If you don't know about it, I'm a Youper, and that's a thing. And so I grew up playing outside, and I got injured a lot when I was a kid because I was doing crazy stuff, right? And oftentimes I had to go to the doctor, and then the doctor was like, oh, it's a growing pain, or, oh, it'll just get better because you're a kid, right? They never sent me for therapy. They never did anything to help. And it was really frustrating, particularly as an athlete, because it would limit then my performance or limit my ability to actually participate in whatever sports season it was. And so by the time I was a junior or senior in high school, I was like, I think I'm going to go into sports medicine, and I'll actually listen to my patients. Right? I'll actually try to help them. I went to undergrad, pre-med bio major, and then really was interested in athletic training and being on the field and kind of learning more about the athletes and what happens with them. So I was a student athletic trainer in undergrad, and then worked with the sports med doctors, who of course would be on the sideline with us and whatever. And the more I got to know them, the more I realized that they didn't really do anything either. I mean, they didn't get to know their athletes or their patients. Either you need surgery or you don't, and then I'm referring you to physical therapy, or go back and work with the athletic trainer. And I was like, well, actually want to help people. I don't want to get stuck in the system, because I learned that the healthcare system was, very, in these little tiny boxes, and not every athlete fits in that box. So I was like, I'm just going to be a really good athletic trainer. And I learned fairly quickly that athletic trainers at the time, it's changed now, but at the time really had limited access or limited ability to manual therapy skills. There weren't a lot of classes available for that. And I knew that athletes got better if you actually touched them and worked on them a little bit. So I'm like, okay, well, I'll go to PT school so I can be a better athletic trainer. So that's kind of where that led me into PT school, which I hated. I couldn't stand physical therapy school.
Really?
It was terrible for me. I didn't like anything about it.
I didn't know
It
that.
out. So that was interesting. But that led me, I went to Emory in Atlanta, and I worked as an athletic trainer for the university as a grad student, or a grad athletic trainer, while I was in PT school. And I met Karen Davis through that, and our mutual friend. And Karen was a great mentor for me. And so her and I stayed friends, stayed in touch after. And so that's kind of like a little bit of my background. Then I worked for a big outpatient sports medicine clinic that was part of a system in Green Bay, Wisconsin. And I got to do a half and half job, which was awesome. So I was half doing athletic training, covering school events, some professional sporting events, some different things like that, which was really fun. And then pulling that into the clinic. And when I first started in that clinic, the PT who left, whose job I took, was their orthotic guru. He was the guy that did biomechanics and orthotics. So they're like, well, you're coming in, we need you to learn this so you can take over his role, right? So I started straight away, started taking biomechanics and orthotic classes. And I'm a very analytical person and very good at analyzing that stuff. So it was a really natural fit for me. And so really kind of honed in and niched a little bit into the biomechanics side of sport and working with my athletes and patients in that regard. Yeah, and then from there moved to Chicago. A friend of mine had a clinic there, and they were expanding, opening some new clinics. And he's like, "Hey, can you come and run a clinic for us here? You know, we'd love your sports background or whatever." And it was just time for a change for me. So moved to Chicago, and I was there for a few years and did an outpatient ortho clinic there, covered a couple of other sports events on the side as an athletic trainer, and actually did a lot of work comp cases, which was kind of interesting. I hadn't done that before, so I learned work hardening and some of that kind of stuff. Worked really closely with a few orthopedic surgeons in the Chicago area, which was great. Learned that, and then we also did hand therapy. We didn't have an OT, whereas in Green Bay we had an OT, like a hand therapist. So I actually learned a lot of hand therapy stuff while I was in Chicago as well. So that was kind of helpful and useful. And again, it's very mechanical. So that was quite interesting for me. And then Karen Davis called me and she's like, "Hey, I started working in professional tennis and they're always looking for people. I gave them your number." And then I don't know, like 2 days later, I think either you or Kathleen called me and, and then I was like, no, thanks. It took a year before I finally showed up there. And so we've actually known each other for 20 years now.
I know. I know. It's like, where does the time go?
Yeah, that was 2003.
I know. And so then, yeah, so maybe tell the listeners a little bit, because of course I haven't really talked too much about my experience on the tour. So talk about, what it was like to be, a primary healthcare provider on the WTA tour and travel around the world, taking care of the best athletes around.
Yeah, I think well, my favorite thing was working with people like you, right? Like you were such a great mentor to me, but we all were, right? Because we had an international staff of PTs from all over the world that were trained differently, all with a love for sport. And so we just learned so much from each other constantly. I mean, dry needling wasn't even heard of in the US, but we had colleagues from Australia that were doing it, right? And that was just awesome to be able to do that. And so I think that was just this huge eye-opening thing. And I'd worked in sports for a long time, so I'd been with sports med doctors, I'd been with sports dietitians and sports psychologists, so none of that part of it was new for me. A great part of the WTA for sure, that collaboration, but just had the skill level of our coworkers as primary healthcare providers was just amazing, and I learned so much and really honed my skills. So that was awesome. It was tough. It's not an easy job.
I know.
Very, very rigorous. Worked insane hours. When people ask me about it, I'm like, well, one time I worked 52 days in a row straight without a day off, and they're 15 or 18-hour days, and that's not a lie.
Nope, totally not a lie. I've done that too.
Yeah, exactly. So that part of the job was kind of brutal. It was very energy zapping and sometimes a little defeating, but we saw the instant results with the athletes, because when you're working with a high level elite athlete and they're getting treatment sometimes multiple times a day, they're just on this whole other level than the general population. So having that instant gratification, oh, they got better and now they just went and performed and they won, and that treatment was helpful, like that part of it was fantastic as well. So yeah, I did that for 7 years full time, 3 years as a contractor, and it was a lot, but it was great, and I was happy to leave when I left. It was good timing for me. And then I stayed in sports. I moved to California and opened a huge sports center with a friend of mine, and was there for 10 years. And we had this huge facility, and our primary sport was volleyball, and it was predominantly high school girl volleyball athletes that were there. And then that kind of led me to where I am now. We opened this big facility. We have about 300 girls that play volleyball that were there on a daily basis. And we had an athletic training room set up for them in my PT clinic. So between 3 and 9 p.m., it was pretty much just triage, similar to on the tour. Whatever athlete got injured, needed help, came in. I had student athletic trainer. I had a massage therapist and strength and conditioning coach working for me, some staff that could help. And that was really fun. And then what happened was these kids would come in, they'd get this, treatment and get better, and their parents would come to pick them up or would call me to find out what was going on, or I would talk to their doctors about, there's an injury, go see this doctor, and the doctor would call me. So I just started getting a ton of referrals from that. So, from 8 a.m. until 3 p.m., I saw clients in the clinic. And so I shifted a little bit in terms of, because there was a little bit of a demographic that was there. It was these kids' parents, right? Who are now kind of my age now, right? Like, from their mid 40s to their mid 60s. And we have menopause playing into their function, andropause for the men, that sandwich generation of starting to take care of their parents, plus they still had high school kids at home. And so, really started diving a little bit deeper into how to help these middle-aged people. Right. And that kind of led me to functional medicine, right? And so started to really see how different things would affect these people. And then also even the younger athletes or some of the high-level athletes, there's a whole human being behind their injury. And so learning, cellular physiology, learning hormonal stuff, learning food a little bit better. I was able to help people more by recognizing what other things are playing into their aches and pains aside from their physical injuries. So so I did that for a decade, and then that was in the San Francisco Bay Area, and just the grind of that area was tough, right? It's really hard to make a living. I had a super successful, busy practice. It was a 6-week waiting list to get in to see me. I had a PT, an athletic trainer, a massage therapist working with me. We ended up bringing Pilates in. I had a craniosacral therapist sharing space, another massage therapist, and we were just busy, right? So, and I could barely make a living there because it was just so expensive. It was crazy to have a clinic there and still be able to see everybody. People are like, well, why don't you just raise your prices up? Like, you could easily charge like $500 an hour. And I said, yeah. And then who's my clientele, right? I like helping my high school kid. I like helping my teacher. I like helping the postman or the UPS driver or whatever. I don't only want to see tech CEOs, right? So, and that, so that was my own choice, but it was tough. Yeah. So I was, left there and moved to North Idaho, of all places. And yeah, it's crazy. I live on 40 acres, waterfront. I'm looking at the lake right now on Lake Coeur d'Alene, and I essentially work part-time and have shifted, my practice. So I see people in person part-time, and then do online telehealth clientele. So doing more, health management or advocacy, and kind of helping people figure out when they've tried all these different things, seen all these different practitioners and gone through all this stuff, and no one's giving them answers. I kind of help really pull the whole picture together for them, and then be like, okay, we've looked at everything down to the root cause, and it seems like it's an endocrine problem for you, or it is your spine's out of whack, that's leading you to have, these different symptoms or whatever. So really kind of helping direct people into finding the right care. So.
And that's so great, and I think our experience on the tour as a primary healthcare provider, really opened the door to that more, whole body approach, because we had a team of people. And when athletes came in, right, we looked at everything. We had to look at the whole entire athlete. So I think, you and I have a lot of that in common. But I'd love for you to talk just a little bit about the functional medicine piece, right? Because some of our listeners may have heard about it, maybe they haven't, but kind of what is it, and how is it really different from the traditional model?
Yeah, great question. So I think, one of the, 2 athletes come to mind from the tour days, right? Of having something wrong that was impacting their performance, and them feeling sick more frequently than they should have. And like, what do we do with that? Right. And, it turned out to be Lyme disease, right? In one case, right? And in a weird autoimmune, condition, in another case, and both at the same time. And you and I were kind of stuck handling those 2 athletes, trying to like figure it out. And top 10 players, right? And like, how is this beautiful young woman that's so healthy and at the peak of her career suffering, right? So
Yes.
that really kind of led to it. And that's my inquisitive mind anyway. Nothing is ever good enough for me. I keep asking questions and annoy the crap out of everybody, right? Because I'm like, well, but why? Well, why? Like what you're saying doesn't make any sense. And so like we need to go like figure it out. So that's essentially functional medicine, is like digging deeper to find the root cause of why somebody's physiological experience is off, right? Why we're not functioning normal, right? And sometimes it's anatomical, and sometimes it's at a cellular level from a lung perspective or hormones or whatever. So functional medicine just kind of takes a look at the big picture of all the symptoms. What could it be? What's your environment? What are things that may have influenced your body? And then trying to find out what got thrown out of alignment or out of whack, right? So if you have a hormonal imbalance, or you have exposure to heavy metal toxicity, or mold, or whatever that is, those will impact you. And that impacts you greatly as an athlete who's at this super high level.
Yep.
And that mold exposure, right? Even if you're super healthy, but you're exposed to mold, will change what's happening in your hormones, your digestion, and your sleep. And so those few things that aren't quite right will knock your performance down 5%. And when you're in the top 1% as an athlete,
That's
you
right.
lose 5%, you're out, right?
Yep.
There goes the paycheck, there goes everything. So I think that was the bigger thing for me. And I had excuse me, I had an athlete that I was working with in California. He was a Paralympic sprinter. And he was training, like he had kind of gotten away from it for a while. And then I started working with a lot of adaptive athletes and adaptive coaches.
Mhm.
And one of the coaches I started working with, who was also a strength and conditioning coach, met him, was like, wow, you have a ton of potential still. Like, why did you quit training? And so he started training and was going to go for the next Paralympic Games. And he hit this wall or this plateau, like I just can't get over it, right? And we started to try to figure it out. And so I was treating him pretty regularly and trying to figure it out. And he wasn't sleeping as well. So I started looking at his food. I'm like, maybe you need to give up gluten or dairy, like, because those things cause inflammation, and you just have this recurring inflammation in your body. And then I kind of had this aha moment. He was covered in tattoos, both arms, full tat sleeves, chest, back. And I said, tattoo ink is metal.
Oh,
Maybe
wow.
you have heavy metal toxicity. And so we tested him for that. And sure enough, that was a big part of his issue. So,
Wow.
it's affecting his performance again at that elite level.
Right.
He ended up not actually qualifying for Paralympics. He was off just a little bit, half a second or whatever it is, but that makes a huge difference. And
It does.
so changed his diet, started doing a detox for heavy metal, and, got rid of his symptoms over time. And at that point in time, he decided not to go back to sport. But that, as a PT, we have to kind of consider when somebody isn't getting better, and it seems like they should, is there an underlying health condition that maybe hasn't been discovered that's impacting their ability to heal, because it's affecting their sleep or their diet or all of those things. So that's
Yeah.
kind of a little bit of functional medicine, like why I went that route.
Yeah, yeah. And it's just so important because we see it all the time. I just had a patient the other day came in, with hip bursitis, and I'm doing the treatment that I would normally do that should get better, and she's getting worse. And I'm
Right.
like, something's not right. And sure enough, she was having a Lyme flare, had mold
Yeah.
exposure, all these things were impacting her ability to heal. And it really didn't matter what I was going to do until that is addressed. It's going to be hard to get somebody like that out of pain, and
Totally.
heal. So yeah, so I love the functional medicine approach. And so I'm excited that you kind of went that route and that you're, including that, in your services. So that's really great. So I know you get great outcomes. So let's dive into your top tips for what you think it takes to get great outcomes.
Yeah, great question. And it's funny, I've been listening to your podcast and listening to some of the other people that we mentioned that I know. It's so fun to hear. And I listened a couple days ago to Galen when you had him on. I personally know him, but I was like, man,
Yeah.
he's stealing all my ideas.
I know he gets some
I'm like,
really good ones.
I know. I don't want to use any of his. So I would say kind of 3 tips for success for me. Number 1 is comprehensive care, right? Really taking an extensive history. I mean, when I have a new client, I literally have 2 hours for a new client. I spend, depending on how old they are, right, how long their history is, I spend a good hour going over history. I ask crazy questions. I ask about sleeping. I ask about dental work. I ask about, their sex life, whatever, like everything that might impact their overall health. And that helps narrow down stuff that people might not forget, like, because otherwise when you're treating in a clinic, if you don't have that whole history, they didn't tell you something because they forgot about it.
Yeah.
Right. And then you're 3-4 weeks into it and you can't figure out why they're not getting better. And they're like, oh, well, I had cancer 2 years ago and I had this body part removed. Okay, well, that would have been helpful to
Important thing
know.
to know.
Right. Yeah, exactly. So I am really comprehensive in my history. And then again, I look at the whole person. It's not just a body part. Somebody doesn't come to see me just for tennis elbow, right? What caused that tennis elbow? A lot of times it's coming from the foot or ankle, and people don't look at that. So I'm looking very comprehensively, not only from biomechanics, but also at their overall health and wellness too, and what's impacting their day and their emotional stress and their mental health too is such a big part of it. So being as comprehensive as I can and trying to understand that whole person, I would say. So whatever you have time for in your practice and in your style of clinic, like try to be as comprehensive as you can. And if you're really, you can be very methodical about your history so that you can get the information you need by asking it. So I have a form, I have a form that I don't actually let them fill out. They fill out very generic information, and then I ask them very specific questions because they won't think the way that I do. And I can get through it relatively quickly because I have kind of my system now for being comprehensive. So it doesn't have to take that long. It just depends how much the person talks, right? How much they really want to share with you. But yeah, and then I think another tip number 2, I would say, is creativity. Man, you got to think outside the box, right?
Oh
Like
God, yeah.
especially if they're coming from some, they've already tried PT, they've already been in the system and it didn't work for them, right? So being creative, trying all of the tools, right? Like, if I'm going to try this with you, see how you do after today, but please come back, because even if it didn't work for you, there are other things I can do that I have in mind. I just don't want to do all of it at one time, because then we don't know what works or doesn't work or overwhelm you. So adjusting and trying different tools for different athletes. And that, for me, I think creativity includes some technology. I've used a lot of different technology over the years. I've pared it way down now. I'm back to being relatively basic, just because I'm limiting my practice. But motor patterns, training the brain, right? I mean, gosh, like, I've heard a couple people on the podcast, and the same for me. Breathing patterns. How is somebody breathing, right? If you don't fix that first, nothing else is going to really work, right? So really looking at how do we retrain the brain. I do restorative breathing, which works on cranial nerve sequencing, right? So I've done a lot of work, and I personally know Lois Laney really well. She's fantastic, and she has this whole system for looking at breath work and retraining cranial nerve sequencing. So I'm having people do weird stuff with vision training, and I will often send or refer out to vision therapists, myofunctional therapists, because sometimes the tongue is sitting weird, and that just impacts the whole body, right? So again, just kind of getting creative and comprehensive. And then the third thing, and I think every single person that's been on your podcast has said this, and this is how you and I work as well, is collaboration, right? Yeah. Again, looking at like what other complementary therapies that could help, right? Mm-hmm. I can help somebody for sure, but I may not be the be all and end all, right? Well, the type of PT I offer isn't the right thing. So I'm going to refer out to vision therapy or myofunctional therapy or NUCCA chiropractic. I like a lot. I refer for that. Craniosacral therapy, right? Like, so I kind of built a team of complementary practitioners, and we work collaboratively, or I call you, right? Or some of our other friends. I'm like, this complicated client. And I don't, like, what would you do for this? Right. So just really trying to, again, take that creativity of all the tools, which includes your resources of other people, right? So just being, collaborative in like, how do I help this person? And sometimes helping them isn't me, right? Sometimes helping them, making them better is by getting them to the person with the skill that's going to help them the most, right? So I would say that all C's: comprehensive, creative, and collaborative would be my 3, I would say, primary tips in terms of how I have had success.
Yeah. And I so agree. So, history is so important. I always say the mystery's in the history. Yeah. And so, you just have to ask the right questions and then stop and listen. and the patient will tell you what you need to know. And then we do our exam, and that just usually confirms, what it is that we're suspecting, because if you're asking the right questions, you're going to kind of at least kind of have a hypothesis before you can put your hands on them. So I'm totally with you on that. I always talk about that for my new therapists and when I'm teaching as well. And then of course, whole body approach, I think is just so critical. And, patients are frustrated that they're having to go, to multiple doctors to see for multiple body parts or different issues that are going on, as opposed to one practitioner, who can kind of look at the whole system and then maybe quarterback, right? So maybe the things that we can do specifically in our expertise, but then, like you said, collaborate. And, we may have to go, okay, but I need you to also go over here and see this person. I have people in my practice that do visceral manipulation. Like, that's not my specialty, right? And so, but if somebody needs that, or pelvic floor, then you have those networks within your community or within your clinic. And like you said, you got to get creative and think outside the box. And I think, our experience on the tour definitely taught us that. You're plunked somewhere, in the world, you only have certain supplies. Somebody comes in, they got an issue, especially when it came to like orthotics or taping, we had to just get so creative with what do we have on hand? What does the athlete need? And now how do I try to give them what they need with the resources that I have? And so it definitely made us have to be super creative and think on our feet. And like you said, sometimes what we can offer is not what they need. And I think patients really appreciate when you say, I can't help you. This is not my expertise, or I don't think what we're doing is what you need, but let me help connect you or find somebody who can. And patients really appreciate that. So I'm with you.
For sure. One of the things that I did, and I've had a lot of students come through that have worked with me. I've hired quite a few of them over the years. I take a ton of classes. I'm constantly going to continuing ed. I'm constantly calling my coworkers, and a lot of the continuing ed I do isn't even just for physical therapists, because that's also limited, right? So I go to I was working with this sleep dentist, and I was going to these conferences with him specifically for sleep dentists and how to help kids with airway issues, right? And again, that's not my expertise, but then he and I could work together, because a lot of times it's coming from a cervical issue, right, or a cranial issue. And and so then I would say, like, hey, I think this kid needs myofunctional therapy or whatever, and we would kind of work that way. So doing continuing education outside of the box, so that you learn, not that I'm going to be the expert in that, but I want to understand it so I know how to refer it, right? Absolutely. So even just from PT perspective, right, like I've done a couple levels of craniosacral treatment, or classes, courses in visceral. I've done visceral.
Me too.
I've done all these courses so that I learn it and understand it, and it's not my niche.
Yep.
But I can introduce it. Like, I can get a patient on the table and I can do top 10 craniosacral, the top 10 things, that little first initial thing, just to see how they respond to it. And if we get a good result, then I'm like, great, now you're going to go see this therapist who specializes in that, and they're going to help you. Because a lot of times what I have found with patients, if I initially say, like, I can do this with you, but I also think you need this, then they're like, oh, well, you don't want to help me, you're just going to send me somewhere else, just like everybody else did. So a lot of times I will introduce something that I have a little bit of skill in, just so that they can see what I'm talking about. And then I'll be like, I know someone that's better at this than me. So go see them. And then what I do, and together we can, we can improve your situation. Right. Yeah. So I think that is so true, right? Being able to think outside the box, but then also to know enough about the other stuff so that you actually know what you're talking about when you're referring.
Yeah, it's so important. And I'm right with you. Like I went to some dental conferences as well. And, not so much that I was I'm going to do these things, right? But the more you can be educated on different specialties, whether it be surgeries, or like we work with a regenerative medicine doctor, a myotherapist, different dentists that do different kinds of things for TMJ that, that we don't do, whether it be mouth guards, having those resources and knowing these are options for patients. I mean, that, I think that's huge, because a lot of times doctors or therapists will just go, well, I can't help you. And that's the end. And And exactly. And so I really like to try the best I can, is to have those resources and to have another option for them. So, yeah. So I want to hear your take on a few tips that you think your audience, I know whether it's students, it could be patients, it could be, like when you were on the tour or teaching, but what are some tips that you can provide that your audience really loves about you? I know I have some.
um I think one of the big things from a patient perspective, and I try to also teach this to my students or to young practitioners, is making a connection with somebody, right? Like having a rapport with a patient is huge. So asking questions about who they are, not
Yeah.
just about their injury. And I think
Yes.
that's where that comprehensive history comes in, right? So in the way that I ask questions, and I try to read people, and I'm pretty good at it. If I can joke around with them a little bit, or if I need to be more nurturing, kind of really reading their personality, so that after the first 30 minutes, I hear from people all the time, like, wow, no healthcare practitioner has ever spent this much time with me or
Yes.
ever asked me about what I feel or about how I am, right? And so making that connection, really, that right there gets buy-in. They trust you and want to do that with you, right? So I think that's a big thing. And then I persevere. I want to figure it out. I want to help
I
you. So I'm
know.
not ever going to give up. I'm going to find that other practitioner that can help you. I'm going to take those, late night phone calls or text messages. I really want to help people. So that perseverance, I think they see that as a way of caring as well. And then I would say in terms of, one other thing is being practical. I'm like the most pragmatic person out there, right? So being very practical and simple. People are not going to do a home exercise program that takes them an hour and a half. They're not going
Yes,
to,
exactly.
right? So like, what are 3 things I can give them that are going to take them less than 10 minutes that they can incorporate into their day? And I'm
Yeah.
constantly giving tips like, okay, every day when you brush your teeth, you're going to do this. And then when you're standing at the kitchen sink doing dishes, you do this. Or when you're at work, do this, right? So making little really self-care things that are super simple and practical. They don't feel overwhelmed, and they'll buy in and they'll do much more, right? And then, I'm like, okay, well then 3 times a week, I do actually want you to do a bigger exercise session. And this is what I want you to work on, or whatever that is. And they're more apt to do that if on the day-to-day they have some really simple self-care things that they can do. So if you can empower people by keeping it simple, is huge, right? And my goal always is to empower somebody. I think when I have a new client, my first kind of overall arching goal is enhance their quality of life by improving their function, right? Like, and then empowering them to how to manage their health, or how to not feel overwhelmed or hopeless, right? So kind of like getting that in as an overall goal. And then of course each session I have a little goal for each session, which is to make a change, right? All we want to do is make a change. When you see that there's change, even if at first they go downhill a little bit, okay, but we made a change from something that hasn't changed for you in a long time, right? So now we know we can do something, right?
Yeah, I think, meeting patients where they're at is, that's super important. And, just giving them a few things that are realistic, like, what's going to be manageable for them. Like I always try to establish that on the first go around, right? Because sometimes people are like, I don't like to exercise. It's like, okay, so is it one thing a day, or is it, 3 things you can handle? Like, let's kind of, meet, where you're at, and then let's try to figure that out. So yeah, I think that's super important. And relatability to me is key. I always say to my therapist and to my staff, be interested, not interesting. And I think too often we're caught up in talking about ourselves, and when patients are here and they're coming in for care, the focus needs to be on them, right? And getting to know them, as a person, I think, like you said, builds that relationship, builds that trust. And, then they're more apt to go, okay, this is a partnership, and, you show that you care, and it really can make a difference.
Yeah,
Um,
for sure. Yeah, and it's interesting. I've had a ton of injuries. I like, so when people come in and they see me, oh, this is what their injury is, and I'm like, as I get to know them a little bit, I'll be like, well, I've had that, right? And then they see that I'm not suffering and that I'm like a pretty healthy person and I'm physically active. And so then that also kind of give them hope, right? Like, oh, I've had that herniated disc in my neck. I've had that herniated disc in my low back. I broke my foot, like all these different things too. So sometimes I'll pull that out as a way to relate to people as well. Like I can be like, well, I understand how you feel. I've had that injury before and look how well I am. So I know we can help you. Right. And sometimes that's like, oh, okay. Right. That can make that difference. And maybe she does understand me, right? Understand what I'm
Yeah.
feeling.
Yeah, that relatability. Yeah, that's so true. Well, a couple things that I appreciate about you. I love your no nonsense. I know, like, if I, whether it be as a friend or as a, colleague, when I come to you, you are just not, you're just going to tell me like it is, and you're going to tell me the information I need to know. And, I love that about you. And I love your analytical brain. I mean, I've come to you with several things like gait and, cause complex cases, and you can take all this, like, complicated stuff, and your brain, just the way that it thinks, it'll just kind of siphon it down to be like, okay, like, now let's look at like these three things, and you make it very easy. I remember when you were teaching us, orthotics and mechanics and all, shoe, different types of things when we were working with the athletes on the tour. So I so appreciate that about you, for sure.
Yeah. Everything in life, keep it simple.
That's right. So true. Well, awesome. Well, this has been so much fun to catch up with you. Is there anything else of value you would like to offer our listeners?
I would say to listen to this podcast. Lisa's been a
And
wonderful
share
mentor.
it.
Yeah, and share exactly. She's been a wonderful mentor to me and really knows her stuff. And I would say, keep learning and keep searching, right? If you're not finding the answers for what you think you need, whether that's you as a patient or you as a practitioner, it's out there, right? And just ask, and look for it and call people. And when you ask for stuff or when you share, I have this idea but I'm not really sure where to go, when people hear about that, you have no idea who knows, something that can help you achieve what you want to, right? So I share stuff with people, I would say, is probably the biggest thing. And on that same plane, like I'm right now, part of what I'm doing by shifting my practice to this more part-time in-person thing, is I'm trying to build more resources available to people so that they can find some of that. So I'm working on a video library right now that I hope to post in the new year, and at least get a couple dozen videos starting. And then I'm been working on a book that's going to lead to an app for some information, right? So there's a lot of stuff that's out there now, and then with my niche kind of coming in with some new stuff too in the next 6 months. So again, just trying to help people, right? Help you find other resources. And if you don't ask for help, you'll never get it. So
Yeah, well, I'm excited to see what you come up with, for sure. So tell our audience how they can find you. I will put all your information, in the show notes, but best way if they want to reach out and learn more, or interested in a functional medicine consultation, how do they get in touch with you?
Sure, yeah. So my website is as NW Integrative PT. So NW is Nadine Wegge, or Northwest, however you want to look at it. So nwintegrativept.com, and a lot of information on there, including my contact info. Otherwise, my email has been acting a little funny lately. So just my first and last name at gmail.com is my personal, but that'll get people to me. And you go ahead and post my phone number if anybody wants to call me as well. That's totally fine. But yeah, I have my Rumble channel. It will be coming soon. I'm not actually going to launch it till I have enough content on there, but that'll come up in the new year. Rumble is a video streamer like YouTube, only better in my opinion. So that'll be coming out, and then yeah, I'll let you know when my other stuff finally comes out to the public. So
Awesome. Well, I can't wait. And for all the listeners out there, I'm going to say stay tuned, because Nadine and I soon will be doing a podcast where she is going to interview me.
that's right. Everybody gets to know a little more about Lisa's amazing background.
Yeah, well, I appreciate you and your friendship. So until next time, keep getting great outcomes.